So thank you for being here. This is being recorded. The land acknowledgement was written with the collective input from Erica Tracy, Sasheen Raymond, members of Council of American Indian faculty and staff, and Dr. Cutcha Risling-Baldy's session with the TK-12 cohort. As we gather virtually this evening for the final Equity Summit series for the 2020-21 school year, we acknowledge that the land that many of us are situated on is likely unceded territory of the Wiyot peoples. The names of places in Wiyot language are based on a relationship to the land and the waterways in the region that pre-contact were traveled by canoe. You might be zooming in tonight from a location near Badawat, Mad River, Weegee, Humboldt Bay, or Wiyot, Eel River. As well as being the Aboriginal territory of the Wiyot, this region of Northern California is also the traditional, ancestral, and present homeland of several indigenous nations, including the Hupa, Karuk, Matol, Tolowa, Wailaki, and Yurok peoples. Today, we come with respect to the tribes who have been here for millennia and model how to live in sustainable relationship with the land. We take this opportunity to consider what action steps we can take in addition to acknowledging the land. I'd like to welcome Dr. Chris Hartley, Superintendent of Humboldt County Schools, who's going to introduce the evening.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much, Stacy. And I see folks are still kind of joining on here as we go. So I wanted to just really start with a big dose of gratitude. You know, when you take a look at Stacy's got on the screen, names of all of our presenters. I'm certainly not going to go through and list all the names or announce them, but they're there for our visual reference, and we'll have that as part of the presentation. But when you think about all the time and energy it took to put this really creative series together, you know, beginning back in October and then pretty much hitting every month since then, culminating with this event here in May, I'm just extremely grateful for folks that were willing to share their knowledge, their experiences. We heard from student speakers several times throughout the course of the year, and every one of those moments was extremely powerful. And as I was a participant and watching our students participate and share their stories and teach us, you know, incredible lessons, I was just very proud of them and very thankful that they felt comfortable sharing their stories and that they felt comfortable in this environment. So this is just a tiny first step of our journey here, learning together and growing together. And I just am very appreciative of all the folks who helped make that happen this year. So we'll be planning our next year's event, taking feedback from you all and learning about this experience as we continue designing how we're going to keep this conversation going into the upcoming year. But right now, everybody deserves a little summer break. So I know all our teachers and educators and counselors and everybody out there working, you know, is excited for that. And we've gone through one heck of a year, but we've proven extreme resiliency and lots of creativity and massive amounts of innovation. And guess what? During the whole time, we're building relationships. And I'm very excited about where Humboldt County is at and where we're heading to serve all of our students. So one of the special recognitions that I would like to announce tonight is an award process that we started last year. I'm not sure if our recipient is here. Stacy, do you think she's here? I haven't been able to multitask. I don't think so.
I don't see her name yet.
We're going to go ahead and honor our recipient anyway. So last year, you know, we thought it was important to take a look at who are folks in our community that are really setting an example for equity work. And you could give out lots and lots of awards. Let's just be clear on that one. But for this year, it was real important for us to recognize an individual who's gone above and beyond. Sharon Blanc is our Equity Leader of the Year. Big shout out for Sharon. If she's not here right now, she'll feel all the love and all the applause. And if we were all together, the roof would be blown off the room. But Sharon serves as the president of our local NAACP. She's an advocate and works with Meredith Orem on the TK-12 initiative, provided massive doses of professional development to our TK-12 educators in Humboldt County this year. But she's also a mentor, and she's a great coach. And she's been brave enough to take me under her wing from time to time, and will help me kind of process situations and issues that we're dealing with. And you know, I'm just really proud that she was willing to do that. And I know I probably put her through her paces from time to time, but we all need mentors in our lives, and Sharon's been a fantastic one for me. And I hope she's signed on for the job for life. So she stuck with me. But when she does come around, we'll make sure we get her that award. And it's just important to acknowledge people. So here's, even in a virtual world, I can still show off a little nice token of our appreciation to Sharon Blanc for her leadership. So to keep the program rolling here, Dr. Colby Smart, who serves as the Assistant Superintendent for us at HCOE, he's done a lot of work to help the Equity Series flourish this year. And he's got the distinct honor of presenting our first speaker and guest for the evening, Dr. Virgil Morehead. So Colby, would you go ahead and take that away?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Hartley. Well, good evening, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. It's my honor to introduce Dr. Virgil Morehead Jr. Dr. Morehead is a member of the Yurok and Tolowa tribe, is a member of the Big Lagoon Rancheria, and is the Director of Behavioral Health Services at Two Feathers Family Services in McKinleyville, California. Dr. Morehead received his bachelor's degree from the University of California at Davis and master's degree at California State University, Sacramento. He received his doctorate of psychology in clinical psychology from the Wright Institute in Berkeley, California in 2015. During his graduate work, he completed his doctoral internship at the University of Michigan and a postdoctoral fellowship at Stanford University. His research focused on developing and testing community-based strategies for health promotion with Native American communities. Dr. Morehead is a critical voice in improving the lives of Native youth and our community as a whole. As just one recent example, he is a member of HCOE's Mental Health Career Pathway Advisory Committee. This unique CTE pathway is being created to provide opportunities for local high school students to learn about and explore mental health careers, which are absolutely critical to building a healthy and culturally sustaining community. Along with other community partners, the perspective, the expertise, and the commitment that Dr. Morehead brings to this work is helping to heal our community and strengthen our youth. So Dr. Morehead, I'm going to turn it over to you and just thank you so much for being here. Really, really appreciate it.
Thank you, Colby, for introducing me, and thank you for having me on this last equity-informed speaker series event. I'm going to pull up my slideshow and get going right away. So you know, the title, Can Humboldt Schools Become a Good Medicine? You know, I was the behavioral health director. I'm now the executive director at Two Feathers. You know, to start, I was thinking, I was in a call, Zoom 2 days ago with the director of the Department of Public Health for the state of California, and Dr. Risling-Baldy and I were actually in another call with him today. And the last words that he said was, right now in this moment, his name's Dr. Tomas Aragon. In this moment, it's California's time. It's California's moment, and that culture is health. And it's California's moment to redefine wellness, to being well-being. And so that's coming from one of our top officials in the state of California. And I think as many leaders here on this call and community members in Humboldt County, that it is California's moment, and it's also Humboldt County's moment. And I think the stars are lined up, the theories and the research and the leadership is lined up to make significant impact, positive impact in our community, just as Dr. Aragon says. And so part of you know, a response to that is what I'm going to talk about today in the next 40 minutes. Is first, I'm going to diagnose and discuss the moment and narrow in on what we should focus on, building on the 15, 20 minutes that I talked the last time I was here. I'm going to explore research programming that offers solutions to redefine wellness in schools in our community. And I'm going to center this moment right now within the pandemic within Humboldt County to hopefully inspire and really give not only aspirational but practical on the ground recommendations. And so that's what I'm going to take us through the next 40 minutes. So first, to diagnose what's going on with our youth and families and Humboldt County. You know, I think that we're not a complete outlier. I don't think we're a complete outlier in serving, you know, in doing our best sometimes, but not doing so good in serving groups such as natives and other folks. I think as I go forward, if we could just remember who I'm going to be talking about in my thoughts and my recommendations and my borrowing from research, with a heavy focus within the schools. So a lot of the research and programs that I'm going to be talking about are in schools. You know, I'm trained as a clinical psychologist, but you know, I do have an increasing passion to understand school leadership, administration, and school-based mental health. And so, you know, we're really going to be focusing on these 3 to 5% kids. How do we better serve these youth, these children, these families in our county? How do we better serve them? You know, I was on a talk with Dr. Cassandra Lara Cooper last weekend, and the ketamine sort of curriculum building. And one of the things I was reflecting on just in this pandemic is the tragedies, the murders that's happened in our community in the last year. And if you look at the family histories of not only the victims, but also the perpetrators, the alleged perpetrators, you can look at their family history, and I'll promise you, it's in those top 3 to 5%. And I know because I've been working with these families and youth for the last 4 years in this county. So how do we take seriously disrupting intergenerational cycles? That's the focus of this talk. How do we reach those youth and families, right? And so, you know, I was born from a brief, you know, that, you know, we're returning to school, back to normal, and we got to watch out because the normal already neglected the mental health and the education of those kids. I think we have to watch out and generalize between all Black and brown students, because I think it's also, there's a socioeconomic piece to it. And so, but we have to take that seriously, right? That it hasn't. So in this moment, as Dr. Aragon talks about, what are we supposed to do? How are we going to frame it? How are we really going to make a difference? And so I was on actually a training, and there's a child adolescent psychiatrist at UCLA. His name's Dr. Dan Siegel. And he's, I think, one of the foremost child adolescent psychiatrists, real deal scientists in education, mental health there is. And he talked about that we have 5 pandemics right now. We have the COVID, we have social injustice and racism, we have the false news, right? Where there's distortion of reality and just, you know, social media and just, you know, what is reality, right? And we have climate change. Those are 4. And so he's like, and he's talking to a group of educators, mental health professionals. Those 4, we would all be sort of agree on, right? That these are pandemics. And then he talks and says, well, what can we do about it? What can we do about it as mental health providers or as educators? And the 5th pandemic is what he said we have control over and what we can do about it. And that's this idea of the separate self. That's this idea of individual success and achievement that's not dependent on our community or our family. That's the 5th pandemic. And how do we socialize? How do we help our youth and our families to become more collectivist, to celebrate group achievements, to have a we culture? How do the schools do this? How are the schools set up in a manner that helps with this 5th pandemic? And a lot of what I'm going to say in the rest of my talk is centered on this, because I think that we do have a lot of control over this, the 5th pandemic. which is individualism. And so we had another, working with another local organization. We brought in Dr. Putnam. This was about 2 months ago. And he said the same thing. He said that this isn't the first time these pandemics, and how he described the inequality, the injustices. He broke down since 1880 to 2020 in this survey of where we've went around cultural self-centeredness, individualism, social isolation, and that you can see it in our society. Well, dang well, the schools should be playing a part in reversing this trend of economic inequality, social isolation, cultural self-centeredness. Just like Dr. Dan Siegel saying in his research, longitudinal over the last 100 years, out of Harvard, it's top-notch research. And so, and he said America has reached historic levels of this right now. So how do we take that seriously in our schools, right? And so right now I'm just diagnosing, and we'll get to the solutions, but I'm diagnosing what I see as a pertinent issue and what we can focus on, right? And so the educator, Paulo Freire, the late, one of the best, working within many different impoverished communities, he said schools perpetuate social norms, and the educator cannot be neutral. So we're talking about these pandemics, we're talking about individualism. The educator cannot be neutral, right? Cannot be neutral. And so as I go forward, what do I mean by not neutral? Well, I think if we think about psychology, and I sit in many, many meetings increasingly with local leaders, we talk about psychology, talk about school mental health, talk about nonprofit, public health, education. To serve the youth and families that I'm talking about, there has to be a critical in front of every one of those talks. That we have to critique and not take any take any assumptions or anything taken for granted. We have to critique the field of psychology, critique the field of school mental health, critique the field of nonprofits and how it's set up in sort of this divide and conquer manner that doesn't lead to me, coordination, collaboration, and synergy. We got to critique public health, and we got to critique education. And we have to start from that place. That's being not neutral. And in the talks that I sit and talk to, I can say that that's not the center of conversation, right? And who has got impacted? The research is clear. Who's got most impacted during the pandemic? It's those same kids. It's those kids on the Lost Coast that are overdosing, up for murder. It's those kids that are described in that recent Northern California ACLU report. So why wouldn't we take a critique to the existing frameworks, theories, institutions? I mean, what's the definition of insanity? Continuing to do the same thing and expecting different results, right? So this is the diagnosis right now, the diagnosis. And now I'll get into the exploration of the solutions, Let me put this light on 1 second. Sorry about that. I'm exploring my room, but the exploration of the solutions. So we're at the diagnosis and we're at the exploration now. So Virgil, all right, you're just naming the problems, yeah? But it's really important to frame the problems in the right way, because if you're not framing the problems in the right way, you're going off to the right, the left, you're not making momentum on changing those intergenerational cycles. So let's explore. Promoting medicine in schools. There's models. There's great work throughout the United States on that are very consistent, which I will argue on traditions from African traditions, Native American, Indigenous traditions. There's top level educators that aren't Native, that aren't African, that aren't Latinx, that are using philosophies and ways to help those that are most in need. And so I'm going to break down a couple of those, and I'm going to talk about recommendations. So an expanded view of student achievement. Now, this is Ron Berger, who, is one of the foremost, I think, educators, teachers in the nation. And this is, his, we are crew, that we are all on the same boat rowing together, but he also talks about schools are critical to socialization, just like Paulo Freire, right? This is Ron Berger, in Dr. Berger, in close collaboration with Harvard Education Department. What's the reasons for schools? What are we supposed to develop in our kids? So if we got young men that are up for murder, and it's one generation after a next in some of these families, it's the family, the tribe, community, the schools. There's a responsibility. Who has some of these young people the most other than their families? It's the schools, right? So we are in the business of character development. We are in the business of developing mastery too, which I'll talk about. And this is what, Dr. Berger is talking about, that a teamwork approach to school is an expanded view of student achievement. So let me break that down a little bit more. Is, character development, that how do we contribute? How do we help youth contribute to a better world? Getting smart. Why are people getting smart? I remember, I'll be a little personal, vulnerable here. I remember, doing some cheating in high school because I wanted to get the good grades. I wanted to get into a UC or Stanford. So I took shortcuts, but it wasn't because I wasn't socialized or learned that it's about who you are and who you become. It was what grades can you get so you can get into that UC system. So that's, in this moment, taking very seriously, what you measure matters, right? What you measure matters. What if we're measuring character development, getting smart to do good in the world, work that spreads justice, appreciation, right? In schools, and this is what they do in the crew model, is like the success is based on the classroom, based on the team, not the individual. And guess what? They're actually get more successful on the individual level. Their research is showing that they take that collective sort of team base. We are here to make all of us succeed. Working in the nonprofit community and working locally, you have a successful program. Often you'll be like, oh, I want to do that program. I don't hear, how can I help that program? I want to do that program. This stuff is deep, right? This individualism, this competition, it's deep. And so, we're relying on the schools to help develop our youth and families to be pro-social, to have this team approach, to cultivate empathy and compassion. In some of these, we have contracts with, juvenile hall and working with some of these youngsters, and some of the work is just like the empathy. How do you think that makes me feel? How do you think that makes, let's talk about, do you feel when you make these mistakes? Like, how do we, in a deep manner, cultivate that empathy? In psychology, it's called mentalization, which means to be able to reflect on your inner experience and to reflect on other people's inner experience, right? How do we cultivate mentalization and team orientation in our schools? That's character development, as I'm calling it. I think, so then you're like, all right, that's kind of abstract. Well, what do we do on the ground? How can we implement this? So there's models like, in the pandemic coming out of Boston or Brown, a blueprint for scaling tutoring across public schools, that there's actually excellent return on investment and it works, really intensive individual tutoring rather than just returning, kids into classrooms of 20 people. But then what about cultural tutoring, character tutoring, character development, socio-emotional tutoring, right? How do we break, and then how do we do that in that sort of multi-tiered system, right? Well, I think we got to partner with community organizations, we got to partner with leaders, and we got to create synergy. Now the pods, like these little 3-4, person, ways of doing school. Like, how do we do that? Maybe, because that's kind of the crew, that the team, 3 or 4 youngsters that maybe are not going down the right path. How do we create a sort of village among those 3 or 4 kids, right? Intergenerational mentoring. So we're doing this with, net making. We actually just did this last month. We have which I'll talk, an ambassador program out in Hoopa in Eastern Humboldt. But this is, what Berger's talking about. Craftsmanship, character development. Like how do we do that more with there's other organizations, not just Two Feathers, that doing, good work. How do we create synergy with the schools and the different, organizations and leaders in our area, right? To really have intensive character sort of forming services or interventions or schooling. And so, but I do think I don't want to miss this point that all of this is, as Bruce Perry, one of the top trauma experts, like it's really about how do we create opportunities for relationships? Like, how do we create opportunities for healthy relationships? We could do that through pods, intergenerational mentoring, tutoring. I bet you some of the best tutors in that sort of meta-analysis by Matt Kraft and Grace, they probably got pretty good relationships, right? So these are examples too. In Alaska, this is more of a native specific, starting from the native way of being, how we define personhood, how we define well-being, and going from there. Schools in this county can do stuff like that. And I bet you, I would promise that it wouldn't just be the native students that benefit, because there's traditions and practice and ways of being that comes from indigenous traditions that are actually the best science. And I'll get to that point later on. And so how do we borrow from indigenous native traditions to promote character development, promote socio-emotional skills, right? There's models out there, right? There's plenty of models. I say critique, trauma-informed movement, critical trauma-informed movement. Well, look, there's a Maori trauma-informed care that starts from a different place. Like we have to go that deep, like at the root level of how these theories and these practices and ways of doing things originate. Because guess if we did a Maori or a Yurok informed trauma care, what that would do to trust, probably self-efficacy, sort of motivation for native students, just the framing of it, right? And this sort of is a sort of a kind of a statement of a way of doing things that I borrowed from Dr. Linda Tawala Smith, sing their songs, right? Which I'll get to sort of the recommendation after this slide. But, I think another thing in these slides that I'm showing, like there's incredible research. Dr. Barbara Fredrickson out of, I think, North Carolina or Duke, she talks about how positive emotions positive emotions are just as good as like fruit and healthy food, like on the development of the brain and the development of joy, the development of creativity, focus, like rock solid research. And expands our awareness. And she has this broad and build theory. And so how do we incorporate that into this character development, into these different programming? And then she says, the super nutrient is positivity resonance, which is the epitome of that is a baby and a mother looking eye to eye and laughing. That integrates the brain, that creates creativity, that helps with focus. So how do we create positivity resonance within the most marginalized and vulnerable kids in our county? How do we measure that? Like, so she gives an example, like what doctors do and habits. She borrows from habits, and she says, like a couple doctors, though, when they knock on the door when you're waiting in the office, and they knock on the door, and that the knocking on the door is their reminder to go present and to talk and say, all right, I'm going to promote kindness and compassion to this patient. And so they've built the habit of kindness, compassion, and trying to promote this positivity resonance for their clients that they see. And developing that habit, teachers, knocking on the door, have a habit, kindness, compassion, character development, boom, right? And so here, now the second recommendation, this is going to get a little more critical, but I think that we have to get out of this sort of, and it kind of ties to what I've already said, is growth mindset, grit. Yes, that's important, but really it's about, I think, student agency. So actually we have something going on right now of advocates advocating for a youth native-based teen drop-in center in the up in Hoopa and on the coast. Like that's an example of helping create agency. And I think as the schools, like we have to empower and reach above, not just heal. Like it's not this hierarchy top down. It's how do you create agency, right? Hands up, not hands out. Like not hands down, right? And the research shows hands up, not hands out, the student agency increases. So if you're given a grant in Eastern Humboldt or something, instead of just giving the money, there needs to be a deep understanding of the community. There needs to be a hands up, not just a hand out, because that perpetuates the inequality. That's saying healing, but not agency, right? And so, and the research is rock solid about agency. You know, in Nindu Kundu's work with Pedro Noguera, others, solid research. So this is going a little bit farther, a little bit critical, but it's similar around agency. And this educator, actually follow him on Twitter, but he has some pretty good things to say. And he talks about student agency and anti-racism discipline. And this is what he says. 8 years ago, I met with Richard Carrazzo, the superintendent of San Francisco Unified School District, to be hired. Our conversation focused heavily on race. As we talked, he stated the following. There are two kinds of races. One wears a sheet over the head with holes in the front. The other allows Black and brown students to sleep in the back of their classrooms. Right? We're equal. Like this is equity. It's not the kids or the families. It's the systems and the institutions and the theories. This is the time. This is California's moment, right? Right? Black and brown students sleeping in the back of the classroom is symbolic of systemic racism, right? A discipline system is determined to be racist based on the individual and collective decisions made by educators, producing predictable statistical racialized outcomes. It's not about the intent. It's about the outcomes. we got to take it serious, right? And so what do we got to take serious? The agency, the uplifting Indigenous, African, others, traditions and ways of being and believing deeply in them, right? Because whether it's the Bear River triple homicide or Hoopa, they spent more time in the schools and institutions than probably in families. That's just real talk. So we got to look at the institutions and just be creative and innovative, but really take it seriously that we're part of a community to cultivate agency, heal, and reverse these trends, right? So I think a framework to think about it sort of is like youth organizing, helping kids in schools identify social origins of problems, not this deficit-based, work collaboratively to address quality of life. That's where these kids, where there's 30, 40% chronic absentees in certain districts, like if they're working on something, and all the educators know this, on something that's relevant to their life, they're probably going to show up. So we have to stand up and try to create that. And so, I think the ambassadors, just to use an example of that, I'm not just going all talk and trying to implement some of this, doing the food sovereignty program, which, I think Dr. Cutcha Risling-Baldy is, championing at Humboldt State too. Kids are showing up. Two of these kids were expelled last year. 2 of them. And now they're back and now they're working. They're showing up when they don't have to, right? So the last one, the final recommendations is, I think it's really like from events to intensive programs. Last time I talked about collective efficacy and neighborhood effects. So you have the Harlem Children's Zone as an example of impacting the whole Harlem neighborhood. Dr. Jeffrey Canada, check that work out. That's an example. There's practices there. I mean, obviously there's critiques of that, but there's models out there, right? How do we promote collective efficacy throughout our communities, right? Well, I think we got to go from just not events to really top level intensive programming, not only within the community, but within the schools, and, John Haiti, I'm not saying his name right, but, visible learning, he showed that if there's teacher collective efficacy, the students do better, even based on socioeconomic status. So if the teachers believe in what's going on in the schools and in the district, that actually the research, and these aren't small level researchers, these are serious academic research and programs. I don't, maybe not real serious, but pretty serious, that are taken serious by the government and things like that. So collective efficacy. Here's for this moment right now, a recent, the PACE and others have put out this, restarting school with equity at the center. Like what I come across far too often is like this return to that we already have the solutions. Oh, we know, we know what we're doing. I think we got to come in with questions more. And Nora Gordon, who's a professor at Georgetown, borrow from best practices in other communities. If we feed more research in the same system, we won't fundamentally change the outcomes. We know this. And so what they're putting together here is redesigning school to be restorative places, which is kind of what I just laid out. Now, these are some of, the top level California, educators, right? And so what, at the bottom, you can see some of the people that helped with this recent briefing that just came out. Center relationships, and this is the reopening of the schools. Address whole child needs, cultural identity, relationships, character development, academic. make teaching, learning, and relevant and rigorous. There's the teams, empower teams. There's the collective, right? This is, California Teachers Association. So it's there. Here's a site specific, the Social Justice Academy, Humanitas Academy, designed by teachers down in San Fernando, I think, LA area. Like, they have results. They serve 90%, 6% of our Latinx, 93 are economically disadvantaged and they're outperforming other people in the district. So what are they doing? We should be looking at that. Supportive environments, socio-emotional development, productive instructional strategies, systems of support. It's possible, right? And so as I'm winding down, I think, in this moment, Humboldt County, as Dr. Aragon said, in this moment with California, culture is health. Let's think outside the box. Let's promote wellness, well-being, right? In this moment. Now I have one final point that hopefully is going to tie it on and be a little bit, hopefully persuasive, is returning to Daniel Siegel. Essentially, he's got, one of the foremost in adolescent brain development, brain science. And if you look at this quote, and he started this field, interpersonal neurobiology, which was this idea of like consilience, which is like using all sorts of different academic disciplines to come together. Taught, physicists, neuroscientists, biologists coming together at UCLA. He many of you probably, or some of you know his books, education, frequent keynote speaker in education conferences. And I was just on a talk, listening to him 2 weeks ago with that same, the 5 pandemics. And this is what he ended with his talk. He goes, what I'm finding is, just like I'm saying, there's solutions in other communities that are facing similar issues. What one of the best Western, sort of modern, sort of scientists is saying, that we need to look at the indigenous traditions for the sort of collective orientation, for taking care of the land, for the sort of self-actualization, character development, and the integration of the brain. That he's saying that within, and it's not just North American indigenous, like Fiji, like Africa, and many of the indigenous traditions, in their creation stories, in their mythologies, in their stories, their of how to live a sort of character-driven life, like a positive, it promotes integration, which means health and well-being, in the creation stories, in the stories, right? And so, again, the schools, there's a lot to learn from other traditions to promote the teamwork, the collective orientation, the sort of character development, the relationships, right? And this isn't coming from indigenous researchers, which they'll say it too, even better. But this is coming from some of the best researchers in the world, right? And what I laid out, the 4 or 5 examples, that's rock solid research and programming, right? And so, as an example, is like Maslow's, and consistent with Daniel Siegel's, is like, self-actualization, cultural property. It's a switch than Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And that they say that Abraham Maslow, who started this sort of hierarchy of needs that many businesses and other models use, that he visited the Blackfeet Reservation and that he borrowed a lot of the Blackfeet people's perspectives and forgot to cite it, reference it. Now, this is again just an example of the indigenous traditions and practices and ways of being and child rearing and educate and schooling in relationship building, taking care of the land, that there's wisdom in it. Now, it's not an all or nothing, but I think we should take it seriously. And so, I'll leave with this. Like, actually, I just got a message this morning. 15-year-old Native young man, and he's already dropped out of school. He dropped out in 8th grade. He's, I think probably OD'd, lost his, I think, father and uncle to suicide. Just been through a lot already in his young life. I haven't seen him during the pandemic, but I was trying to track him down before and going, just always trying to check in. And, I'm still worried about him, and we'll see if we'll be able to somewhat keep him in sort of probably a harm reduction model on the right path. But he messaged me at like 5 a.m. I think, "Hey, Virgil, miss you with a heart." You know what I'm saying? Like, this is a young man that is on the trajectory of some of these tragedies, same life history, same life choices. Red heart, like, the kids have it in them. Like, they have it, and it's up to us to create the systems. Another Facebook message from this young man that we sent off. This was like 4 or 5 months ago. Parents switched services and it's not working. We stayed in the game, and he's doing better. And he said, I just want to thank you for everything. I know, I didn't finish this quote, but he's like, I was on drugs. I'm sober now. I'm looking to get a job, and so I know it's possible, but we got to like create. They need so many more resources, and there needed a system from early on to support them, so they want to show up to school, they want to engage, and that we promote that sort of self-efficacy and wellness. And I all that I laid out, I don't think it's rocket science, but I think it is looking at things differently and taking courage, or being courageous, and really being self-honest with ourselves, and seeing that it's larger than a job, it's larger than a profession. And I think we'll be better off. So with that, thank you.
Thank you so much, Virgil. We really appreciate what you had to offer us. It gives us lots to think about. I think Dr. Morehead and Dr. Risling-Baldy, you wanted a 10-minute break here, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to put 10 minutes up on my screen, and we'll see you all in just a few minutes. All right, welcome back, everyone. Dr. Morehead, did you want to introduce Dr. Risling-Baldy?
Yes, I have the honor of introducing Dr. Cutcha Risling-Baldy, who is a Hoopa tribal member and the chair of the Humboldt State Native American Studies. And really, you know, in a very short period of time, becoming one of our foremost leaders in this county around whether it's climate, Indigenous rights, and just, you know, being a leader within the university. Dr. Kutcha Risling-Baldy, you know, I've worked closely with her over the last 4 years. She's our one of our head evaluators on a project that's looking at culturally defined mental health programming, the stick game and flower dance, which she is also one of the foremost experts on the flower dance ceremony of our local flower dance community. And she wrote the book, We Are Dancing for You, an award-winning book, We Are Dancing for You. So, you know, please be ready to be impressed with Dr. Risling-Baldy. Welcome.
Thank you, everyone. I'm happy to be here tonight. I'm going to share some questions in the chat because what we're going to do before I get started on my talk is some breakout rooms and sessions so you all can have a bit of a discussion, reflect on the things that you heard from Dr. Morehead tonight, and then think a little bit about what you still want to know about or things that we can do. I'm also going to share my screen so I can give a few instructions about how this breakout session is going to work. If you look here, so we posed these reflective questions for you, and we want you to consider sort of all the talks, the trainings, the things that you've been doing over the past few months, your sort of total experience after listening to our opening keynote and thinking about all the things you've been learning. Our first question is, what connections do you see between the history of genocide and the history of public education or education regarding Native American peoples? And our second is, what could doing business differently look like for your classroom, school, or district regarding Native American students? Now, those classes we'd like you to do reflection-wise, so you'll have some time in your breakout rooms to just talk about these two topics. And then what I'm going to do is send a message out that says, please, if you can, move to the next two questions. Those questions you'll see are in a different color because we actually would like you to engage in a Jamboard session and use some of the sticky notes through the Jamboard to put down things that you think would be helpful, because this is a nice way for us to see connections that we can make amongst each other, or maybe come up with ideas of things that we want to follow up on. Also, I always say to people, like, some of the best ideas just come out of people talking to each other. And people always say about me, like, don't tell me that there's an idea, because I'll come back to you like a week later, like, okay, I got this thing that you said you wanted to do, and then we have to do it. So I think it gets us imagining what we can do to move forward. So question number 3 is, what are some specific areas of curriculum development, activities, or student engagement that you would like to see developed? And then number 4 is, what is one question that you still have or something you would like to know more about? If you have never used Jamboard before, and I only do this now because I actually did a workshop with like a whole bunch of teachers a couple months ago, and I just assumed that they knew how to use Jamboard, and it was crazy because everybody was trying to figure out how to use it. So Stacy's going to share the link to the Jamboard into the chat. If you click on it, you should be able to get into the Jamboard. Once you are in there, there's a couple of different ways to navigate it. So page 1 is a space to show you how Jamboard works. On the left, you'll see icons. If you look over here, if you click on this icon right here, that is how you add a sticky note. You will type into the sticky note what you want to say about the question, and then press save, and it will pop up on the board. And it's basically like if we were in real life sticking sticky notes that we would write onto the board. My suggestion is that you try posting a sticky note once you get into there. If you've never used Jamboard before, I'm asking you to please post a sticky note and just say hello. It'll give you the practice. At the top of the screen right here where you see these arrows, this arrow's pointing to, this is how you navigate to the next question and the question after that. If you go to the next question, that's where the question is actually posted, where you'll post your sticky notes about our third question. And then the fourth question is posted on page number 2. That's where you will post your sticky notes about that question. So I'm actually going to jump into the Jamboard right now so we can see how it's going for everyone. So this is what our Jamboard is currently looking like. You see right here, people are starting to post their sticky notes. You can make them bigger, smaller, you can move them around. I know we have a lot of people. It is okay if the sticky notes overlap because we are going to be organizing it later to help show people how, like to help get the information together. So right now we just want you to get as many sticky notes as you can. Again, if you go to the top of the screen, you'll see here on page 2, that's where you'll start posting sticky notes when you get to the question, what are some specific areas of curriculum development? Page 3, what is one question that you still have or something that you would like to know more about? So it'd be really, I'm really appreciative that people are posting their hellos. It's nice to see that pop up. We're gonna give you some time in the breakout rooms together. And again, I'll send a message when we should definitely be on to questions number 3 and 4, because that will mean you have just about like 7 minutes left in your breakout rooms to kind of hopefully get some ideas down. Spend, the first 7 minutes or so just talking with each other if you'd like to reflect on some things. If you look at those questions and you're like, actually, I want to talk about this, feel free to talk about something else. If you are really interested in moving right into the post-it notes because you're like, I have some good ideas, I don't want to forget, start posting post-it notes. I'm all right with sort of navigating that side of it. So, oh, Yvonne said that there's too many people in the Jamboard. I don't know if I can change the settings. Let me see. Otherwise, what I'll have to do is create another Jamboard for people. So if you couldn't get into this one, I'll make a copy of the one that we're doing right now, and then you can get into the second one. So we'll share the link in the chat to do that. Let me see. I like that. Too much jamming. That's a good one. Good one, Yvonne. All right, so we're gonna create the breakout rooms to stick you in there. I don't know, Stacy, did you want to create the breakout rooms or do you? All right, and then we will put you in there, and again, I will send you a message as soon as we have just about 6 or 7 minutes left. We're gonna post, I'm gonna go ahead and post the other link in case you couldn't get into the first Jamboard. Let me update the settings because I don't want it to be. So here is the copy of the Jamboard. So this is the second place that you can post things. If you aren't able to get into the first Jamboard, click on this link and you should be able to get into the second Jamboard. So there's 2 Jamboards that we're running. This will be exciting. So you got the first Jamboard up at the top and then the second.
So I'm going to open the breakout rooms, and our practice is to use the full minute when the timer starts counting down, use the full minute until you get sucked back.
I got to do this thing first.
Yay, everybody's back. And what I really love is that it's, what time is it? 6:20, and people are they're jamming on the Jamboard, and I really appreciate that. I appreciate when we can get this many ideas and things out. I hope that we can follow up with them and see a little bit more about, the ways we can build connections across what we're writing. So it's my turn now. I'm supposed to do like a keynote speech and I guess inspire people. But again, you can keep writing on the Jamboard. I'm down with it the whole time. And I always say to people, I'm pretty good lately at navigating like the chat and everything else. When I share my screen, I'll try to navigate it as much as possible. But I wanted to start by saying that I'm glad to see everyone here. And it's always really weird to come present to the Humboldt County Office of Education because a lot of like my teachers from school are here, and I always have to call them, like I call Mr. Hartley, Mr. Hartley. And that's just my life, I think, forever. And my high school Spanish teacher actually teaches at Humboldt State, and I still call him Senor. Like I can't not do it. So so I grew up here and was really fortunate to attend Arcata High School. I graduated. I don't tell people the year because I'm always like, it's not your business how old I am. But a while ago. And now my stepson is graduating from Arcata High School this year. And my daughter is going to start attending Arcata High School next year. So she's going to be a freshman at Arcata High School next year. And I think it's really interesting to think about my experience in education and then like re-experiencing it as a mom and kind of like going through it as a mom of these kids and thinking about like what I want them to know. And I didn't know where I was going to start tonight. And then I remembered like, oh, I have this story about when I was in high school. You know, you have to take U.S. history. And I was in the class and I remember that the book that we were learning, the textbook we were learning was started with the land bridge in terms to talk about Native Americans. And I came to class that day and I was like, you know, I did all this research and I have a issue to pick with this land bridge, you know, section to discuss Native Americans. And the teacher was a substitute and he was like, I just have to teach it because it's in the book. Like I can't, like that's what's in the book. And I was like, no, I get it, but there's a lot of stuff we could talk about. And he's like, but it's in the book. And I think at that point, I sort of just decided that like we had to write better books. And that it was time that like we were the ones writing the books, because if you didn't write the books, then suddenly people couldn't understand it. And then as I went off into higher education, I kind of really kept that as part of my life. Like I have to be the one writing the books. Like we have to be the ones that write the books because that's how we're going to get people to engage with what we're talking about. And so I thought a little bit about what I wanted to talk about tonight. And I think aside from, so when I graduated from Arcata High, I went to Stanford University. My husband, he brought me iced tea. And when I do talks, he always gives me my Stanford alumni mug. So I can like, you know, front to people without actually doing it, like as I'm talking, in case they wonder, like, what are your qualifications? So, but so I went to Stanford, and I had to take this Western Civ course. Like you had to do your introduction to Western civilization, and then you had to do a second humanities course the next quarter. So there was like 2 you were required to take, and both of those classes used Plato's Symposium as like one of their foundational texts. So I had to read it 2 quarters in a row. And then both of them also used King Lear. And I had just read King Lear in my senior year of high school. So like for 3 years, like a year plus 2 quarters in a row, I read King Lear like 3 times. And then I read Plato's Symposium like twice. And I came to my TA one day and I was like, is there nothing else to read? Like in the history of all of literature, is there nothing else that we could be reading? And they kept telling me this is the foundation of what you have to know to like be a person, to like do this work, to be smart. You have to know Plato's Symposium and you have to know about King Lear. And I just started really thinking about like, what does it mean to be in control of who we read and what we read and how we read and why we read it? And then I really started doing a lot of work on trying to find the other voices, like the voices that I wasn't learning. And I do this thing with students all the time where I'm like, raise your hand if you've read The Great Gatsby. Raise your hand if you've read Romeo and Juliet. Raise your hand if you've read anything by John Steinbeck, right? Like, and then they always are raising their hands. And I said, what do we know about all those people? They're all white male dudes. And then I was like, and then that's what we get. We get this sort of point of view of life from a very particular perspective. And then we're told that that's like the universal experience. And then we wonder why we walk out of that like feeling really not seen, not heard, but also like the world must not have been created for me because it's really only through this one perspective. And so I kept thinking about that. And then when I graduated, so I did psychology as my undergraduate major. Everybody always asks me why, because they're like very interested in how education goes, my students too. And I said, I majored in psychology because I was a biology major, because I was going to be a doctor. And, but their classes started at 8 o'clock in the morning. And I was like, no, thank you. So I looked up the major that had classes that didn't start at 8 o'clock in the morning, and that was psychology. They all started after 10 a.m. And the psychology department wouldn't teach classes on Fridays. So I was like, that is the major for me. And I majored in psychology. But I did a lot with research and scholarship, and I learned so much about how I could help my community through this other major. Because I had been told if you want to do the work, you either got to be a doctor or a lawyer, right? So I was like, that's how I went into college. And suddenly I was like really exposed to all these things I could do just because I kind of found this other major. While I was majoring in psychology, I got invited to do a talk in front of the entire Stanford campus. And they asked me to write just like a speech, a talk. And I wrote this speech about how when I first got to Stanford, they were doing movie nights. And one of the movies that they made a decision to show on our movie nights, our freshman movie nights, was called Far and Away. And it starred Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman. It's like their first movie they did together as husband and wife. It's about these Irish immigrants who come over to America. They're very poor and they're trying to make their way. And one day they find out that they're giving away free land in Oklahoma. And they all go to Oklahoma and they do the run and they claim their free land. And then they get to live happily ever after because they become landowners in this new country where they would have been very poor people over in Ireland. And I was sitting there watching the movie, and all these people were like this one girl was crying, and she was like, isn't this amazing story about what was happening and how they were able to sort of like live the American dream? And I said, well, does anybody know what else was going on in the middle of Oklahoma during that time, during the land rush? And they were like, no. And I was like, they're taking Indian land. They're displacing Native people. And I was very like upset. But I was like telling this girl, and she was like, well, I just think it's a good story. And then I said, we need better stories. So I started going to creative writing classes. And then one of the professors was like, well, you're a writer. Like, you should actually go and be a writer. And I remember I was talking about it with people, and one of my aunties looked at me and said, writers are poor. So I was like, okay, I don't want to be a poor writer. But I do want to write. So I went to get my MFA in creative writing and literary research. And then when I was done there, I was like, well, I'm going to keep going, because when I graduated from my MFA, my great uncle wrote me a card, and he was like, when are you going to get your PhD? That's all it said in this card. And then that was my graduation card. So I was like, I guess I got to go get my PhD. And I decided to do my PhD at Davis in Native American Studies. So I have a lot of very different disciplinary backgrounds. It's what Audra Simpson, who's a really good Indigenous scholar, calls being intellectually promiscuous. She says that's exactly what we should be doing. That's Native studies. That's this value that one discipline doesn't have the answer. One point of view isn't the way to go. We have to pull from multiple places to understand this world, and we should teach people how they can learn in multiple ways and work in very different ways with each other across disciplines, so that nothing is separate. Because in Indigenous studies, you don't do science without art and without culture. You don't do art without understanding math, and you don't do math, right? All these kinds of ways that things connect. And when I was getting my MFA and my PhD, I did a lot of work on the literary canon, because one of the things that we had to do when I was getting my MFA is really read the literary canon. And then I took a multicultural literature class, and then I learned how to become a writing teacher. And I worked in the writing and rhetoric department to learn how to be a writing teacher. And what I found out is there's a lot of assumptions about people and how they write and the ways that they understand the world. And when you look at the studies, what you find is that a lot of the time when students are writing, they're sort of being really put into a very particular box about how they're supposed to talk, how they're supposed to sound, how they're supposed to like invent, the ways in which they're supposed to structure. And we teach people as if writing is a structure and that you do something in a very particular way. And then what we do is make it very difficult for them to understand things from their own language and cultural perspective. So a lot of the times people will write and they'll write from how their brain works, and maybe they put things in different orders because in like our own languages, we're not talking the way that English puts sentences together, but sometimes I think we put sentences together much better than what you would say in English. Yet if I wrote it down, people would say, this is incorrect, like it's grammatically incorrect. And I really, really thought about the stories that I had been exposed to, and I just started wondering, like, why did I never read Leslie Marmon Silko or Louise Erdrich or sort of like like Joy Harjo when I was in high school? I did read the Canterbury Tales, which, like, to be fair, I thought was hilarious. But also, like, there's a lot of other things we could have read, but the Canterbury Tales on top of everything else, right? And then this summer, this past year, my stepson was in English and he was reading The Great Gatsby. And he was very frustrated with like the way that things were going. And he said to me at one point, like, I don't know what the significance of the light on the end of the dock is, like the green light. And I was like, well, let's look it up. Let's talk about it. And I was telling him and he goes, why do I have to know this? And I was trying to like explain to him like what was happening. And I told somebody, you know what I figured out about the pandemic is suddenly I have to like stick up for the curriculum because I need him to learn it so he can pass the test. So I was like, it's very important that you know the green light from The Great Gatsby in life, because then you'll understand a bunch of movie references. Like, I don't know why we think Fitzgerald is the most important voice to have this conversation, right? I do this a lot with people because I actually got a question from a student once that was like, what do we do with the literary canon? Or like, what happens if we don't learn it? And I was like, you know, the literary canon is bunk. It was literally made up. It has nothing to do with life. If you never read Shakespeare and you came to me and was like, I've never read Shakespeare, I'd go, oh no, like, I don't know, like you probably read a lot of other stuff. I think you're gonna be okay, like in the world. So I keep thinking about like how we push back against this idea that somehow we're like foundationally creating good people instead of thinking about how we can create amazing thinkers and dreamers and imaginers. And there's something really important because I went to a talk one time where this woman said, you know, we have an easier time like imagining what we're going to do in a zombie apocalypse than we do imagining the end of capitalism or how we're going to rebuild the world post-capitalism, or imagining the end of racism, or imagining the end of settler colonialism. We can't do it because we aren't given the tools when we're growing up. We don't have liberatory imagination spaces that are created through our literature and our assignments and the ways that we do things so we can think about the next world. But what Indigenous peoples are always doing is building radical imaginative spaces. And they have been doing that since the very beginning. They invite people into a conversation through storytelling that's like, think about what the world could be. Think about what it could look like. And they open up liberation imagination. Now, what's really important about that I say to people is we have all the tools to do that. And one of the reasons why the sort of violence perpetuated against us happened was because we represented a liberatory imagination. We were a people who existed before settler colonialism and capitalism. We know it. We have stories about it. We know what it looks like. We understand it. We can tell you about it. We've passed those stories on for generations, which means we have the tools and the like space to be able to imagine beyond it, which makes us scary to the system, to like the way that it works, because we're the ones that can do that for people and we represent it. Like every day that we live, that's what we represent. So what happens in your education is they have to try to find some way to convince you that settler colonialism and capitalism is normal and that everything else doesn't make sense outside of that. So they spend all 12 like grades trying to tell you that this is how it's supposed to work, so that it becomes really difficult to imagine beyond that. And we do that in everything, the canon, the way we teach, like the kinds of things we assign, even the way we talk, the kinds of words that we use. Even in our grammar rules, we do it. I got into a big fight with my copy editor when I did my book because I insisted that we capitalize Indigenous. And I also told her that I would not italicize Indigenous languages. And she was like, why? And I said, italicizing the language on the page makes it foreign to the space. It marks it as other. And I don't want to mark this language as other. I want people to be like, this is part of the language that we're using here. And if we're making something foreign in space, we should really italicize all the English, because that's what's foreign to this space. So to like kind of think about the way that we do it in everything. I do this thing with my writing students where I talk about like terminology. Things like when we say personification, for instance, is a Western terminology. This idea that you personify something, an animal, a plant, a tree, the idea that you're personifying it. It's something you're giving personhood to, rather than it has personhood itself, that it is personified, that we don't do that. It just is. It exists as its own being. And so we kind of we constantly use the language, like the ways we write, the ways we talk, everything is set up to sort of box in our imagination of what the world could be. And this is why I always say we have to push for the other voices, the most marginalized of voices, to be at the heart of like how we can liberate our imaginations. And that's the work I do in what people call decolonization. So I'm going to tell you just a little bit tonight about decolonization and why it's kind of like a buzzword, I think, at this point, and how we don't want it to be a buzzword. We want it to be an action. We want it to be something that we're all working on together all the time, and that we understand is a process, but ultimately cannot be what they call metaphor. So there's a great article by Eve Tuck and Kay Wayne Yang, who are both in the education field, and it's called Decolonization Is Not a Metaphor. And what it's saying is, in the educational field, we tend to use it as metaphor, like I'm going to decolonize my bookshelf, or I'm going to decolonize my garden, or and they're like, that's not what this is. This is about actual actions toward liberatory moments. This is about land return. It's about how we center Indigenous peoples. It's got to be real. And if we're signing up for it, we're signing up for real actions. And I think about it in terms of my own children, how they can kind of feel like in space, empowered by curriculum. Because what we do right now is disempower students, especially students of color, from the curriculum. So they learn a particular story about themselves. And this is not the story that they know from home. It's not the story that they know in their like blood memory. It's not the story they know in their DNA, but it's the one that they're told. And then what we see are statistics that say that Native students are the least likely to graduate from high school, that they're the least likely to go to college, that they're the least likely to finish college. And we start to think, why is that? And then we look at what happens to them in schools and we realize it's like a really disempowering narrative, as if it's not for them, it's not by them, and it won't be with them. So they get pushed until they can't see themselves in the stories that are being told. And the interruptions that we do to that, as like their family members, their aunties, their uncles, right? The people that they encounter become really important moments to remind them that there are people that are doing this work and that are willing to step forward to help them with that. And to give them the strength to be able to disrupt themselves. It took a lot as a high school student to constantly be that kid. Everybody always asks me like, what can we do? And I'm always like, just speak up first whenever you're noticing something like that happening. Because it takes a lot out of us to constantly be the ones that speak first, to constantly be the ones that raise our hand to be like, well, I mean, I have something else to say about that. To constantly have people kind of looking at you like, of course you're going to say something, right? Of course you are. If everybody else in the room said it first, then you feel like, cool, it doesn't have to be me. It's like taking kind of some of the pressure off. Although I do call it being an Indigenous Debbie Downer. I was like, that's my kind of role in life, because somebody has to do it. So people will like invite me to their birthday parties, and because I'm real fun at parties, just so you know. And they'll be like, will you come to my party in wine country and we can go around like tour the wineries? I'll be like, yeah, I'm happy to. Did you know that wine country was built off of the slave labor of indigenous peoples who were imprisoned on their own lands by the mission system and then made to plant wine, like grapes for wine, in order to make the wine for the Catholic mission system? And then you fast forward to now, they're seizing the water from most of our territory to uphold that wine industry, even though it's to the detriment of like the environment and our salmon and our water. But cool, I'll go. And then they're like, yeah, you're great. Like, we loved inviting you to parties. So I think to be the other people that say things is important, especially for our young people. They have to hear people saying the things so that they know that they can say the things too, and that things are going to be okay. So I'm going to just do a very quick share of my screen to go through a few things for you about decolonization, and then we'll have some time at the end, hopefully, to talk a little bit, maybe ask some questions. So let's see. Here we go. Again, my fundamental questions are who we read, what we read, how we read, and why we read. Like, and all these things actually take a lot of time to discuss. I teach whole classes about it, right? But I'm going to tell you these are where I'm fundamentally coming from. So here's what happened. I was up in the middle of the night one night, about 3 o'clock in the morning, and I couldn't sleep. And I was on Twitter, and I, for some reason, decided that what I was going to do is start tweeting these. I call them Native American short stories. And so I did like a whole series of Native American short stories from like 3 to 5 o'clock in the morning, where I was just rewriting the literary canon from the perspective of indigenous peoples to kind of tell you about, like, you know, how we would tell these stories very differently, or also we would have very different experiences, and what we're actually learning are very Western perspectives of what it means to be a young person or what it means to like engage. So this is my Native American short story for Romeo and Juliet. And it's just a Native grandma saying, you're 13, Juliet, get back to the house. Talking about, I'm going to go take this potion and pretend to be dead. I'll give you something to pretend to be dead about. You best head home, Romeo. I'm about to call your mom. Because in my mind, where was their family? Right? Like, where was their family to be able to be like, what is happening here? So, and, you know, this one was Native American short story, The Catcher in the Rye. Because I hate Holden Caulfield, but you know, whatever. So Holden is like, I am very smart. I am a teen and I know everything. Everyone here sucks and I am so bored with life. And then his native grandma is like, somebody's bored, which means somebody wants to clean pine nuts. And then he says, I don't want to. And she goes, that wasn't a question. This one is Native American short story, The Iliad. Now, to understand this, you have to understand that Native cultures, even though people don't know this, were very feminist, and they believed in the equality of all genders. And women had a significant amount of power in Native cultures prior to colonization, which was taken apart by colonization. So I did The Iliad. I said, so Helen, these dudes will fight, and whoever wins marries you. And Native Helen goes, excuse me? And they said, they'll fight. And she's walking, and she's walking away, and she's in her car, and she's flipping me off, and she's gone. Native muses will go, and she lived happily ever after. Right? This one is Native American Short Stories, version 2, the Walden. So Thoreau says, I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately. These are actual quotes from Walden, by the way. And the native says, can I help you? Because again, there's no wilderness. And Thoreau goes, the rust is but another name for the wild. And the native says, hey man, that's my front yard. And then Thoreau is like, a vast untamed wilderness. And then the native was like, I mowed yesterday. Because we can't even be seen in Thoreau. He erases us from land all the time. That's sort of his goal. This is Native short story, Sense and Sensibility. Oh no, poor Mrs. Dashwood's husband died and she only has daughters, which means they can inherit his estate because women are equal to men in Native cultures. They can decide who to marry and divorce. Also, they can serve in government. Bean. Very different sense. This one actually got the most, retweets? Native American short story, Indian in the Cupboard. Native narrator, nope. Boy protagonist, see this magical cupboard? Narrator, nope. Boy, I put in a toy Indian. Narrator stares at camera. Boy, he's real, but for me to play with. Narrator, shut it down. We're done here. And then I did this one because actually I was doing a presentation on Junipero, and I wrote, in fourth grade, students have to learn about how nice missionaries were. Narrator, they were not. How they taught natives to garden. Narrator, they did not. And to grow corn. Narrator, it wouldn't grow well here. Also, it was natives who taught them to grow corn in Mexico. So Edward Said asks us to think about who writes, for whom is the writing being done, and in what circumstances. And he reminds us that all of these questions involve a politics of interpretation. And that when we are teaching interpretation of the text in which we teach, we are teaching a politics of interpretation. We are making decisions about how we want our young people to interpret the world. And we cannot think that there is not politics to teaching interpretation. And instead, we need to understand what it means when we interpret in a way that actually empowers marginalized peoples and voices versus just thinks about what it means when you empower Western ways of thinking and knowing. So I think a lot about that. And then I think about the works that we do with what they call contested histories, contested objectivity, and contested narrative. This idea that like everything we've read, everything that's been written is contested, and that our voices would have very different ways of writing about it. That objectivity should be contested, that the narrative should constantly be a space to contest, not a space of this is what the interpretation is. And I remember like when I was learning in English, there was always like, you have to know the symbology of this or the way that this works or why King Lear has a nervous breakdown. And you couldn't write because he's an asshole. You had to be like, well, because there's, right, like all these kind of things. As if there's like a singular interpretation, a way that we're supposed to view the world. You are teaching young people how to view the world. So how do you sort of open up their spaces of what that looks like? I use this example with my students where I say our ways of writing history, our ways of writing, our ways of teaching people how to write, make interpretations for them about and make judgments about what is happening. And we have to know that every word choice is a judgment, that we are making judgments as authors. We can't think of there's an objective way of saying something. So I use this example where I give them the different ways you could write about when Abraham Lincoln got shot. So I said, you could write Abraham Lincoln was shot. You could write Abraham Lincoln was murdered. You can write Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, or you could write Abraham Lincoln was shot. He later died from his injuries. All those are choices, judgments about what we want people to understand about the thing we are writing. Each one of them carries a different weight. Each one of them tells us how we feel about the thing that we're reading, and they send a message to the other people. This, a lot of the time, will open up so many ideas for students where they're like, it didn't dawn on me that what I was learning is how to internalize a certain judgment about what was happening. I said, you likely heard that Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. It made you think of him as a very important person, as if there's some kind of really important thing that happened around it. If we wrote about it as he was shot, we would ask questions like, who shot him? Did he shoot himself? Did he die? Right? Like all these kinds of things. If you say the last one, and this is what tends to happen a lot on the news, they say these things like Abraham Lincoln was shot, he later died from his injuries. Whose fault is it in that sentence that he died? And then you think about like what that means in terms of interpretation. So things should be contested, and we should learn how to analyze and understand that. So when we think about why, this comes a lot from Decolonizing Methodologies. This is Linda T. Smith. If you haven't read the book, you should. A lot of people always ask me, I want to do work in decolonization. What should I do? And I'll say, did you read Decolonizing Methodologies? And then they'll say, no. And then I'll say, it's 20 years old. I feel like you could read it now, and then we could have a conversation about decolonization. But don't hire me to come explain it to you. Read it. Like, dedicate yourself. If you want to do decolonization, you've got to start with a book, and then we can kind of move into the next part, right? So Decolonizing Methodologies reminds us what's at stake when we think about the way that we talk, write, and engage with things, especially with our young people. And what she says is that history has been linked to European imperialism and colonialism. Like, that's really what is foundational to the history that we learn in the classrooms. It's European imperialism and colonialism. It's about justifying those things. She also says that when you think about it, our claims to land, language, knowledge, sovereignty have always involved contested accounts of the past by colonizers and colonized. And you see the effects that it has on us today. How people write about us in the history textbooks determines how they write policy, how they make decisions about land, how they make decisions about healthcare. What they learned in the classroom determines how they approach us when they're talking to us about water use, about saving salmon. When they talk to us about our projects and our programs, they have internalized what they learned in school about us. And then they think that's what they know. And so we contest that history, and then they go, no, that history is fact. It's just sort of how it was. And then we come in with like, well, did you know this? And then every time people are like, I had no idea. I had no idea. So this is important because it sets up like how people respond to us today. Now, the other thing is the indigenous language of critique is understanding that imperialism and colonialism is continued and ongoing. We live in an imperialist colonialist society. We are under the umbrella and we are foundational to us right now is imperialism and colonialism. We have to know that. We have to see it everywhere so that we know that when we're teaching it, we have to push back against it, or otherwise all we're teaching is the methodologies, the pedagogies of imperialism and colonialism. Now, what she also says is that history is not about justice or enlightened decisions about the future. It is about power. And what is taught in our textbooks and what is taught in our classrooms is about establishing power, the power of the United States, the power of this settler colonial culture to be able to say that this is the one we're supposed to operate under. We need to teach people to understand when they are learning about power instead of learning about history, and then be able to tell different stories. And history has been used to establish who are the powerful, who are the most important voices. Finally, she says that it's Native Nation self-determination that is what's going to get us out of this. And she said what we have to do, this is her methodology, is rewrite, W-R-I-T-E, and rewrite, R-I-G-H-T, history. This is like the foundational decolonizing methodology, is to rewrite and rewrite. Now, I think what's really important to understand about decolonization is that it helps us to reimagine relationships with land, people, education, and the state, and it prioritizes indigenous knowledge, goals, and values. But to keep in mind that it requires study, conversation, and practice. It is an unlearning of the things that we have learned. It's not a one-off. You can't do a singular training and be like, now I'm decolonizing. It's making a dedication to like an actual praxis of what you're going to now do for the rest of your life. You're going to work for decolonization. Now, the things that we have to do to sort of apply this is to unsettle the like Western practice. So you have to first practice humility and say like Western ways of thinking, knowing, and being are not necessarily the best, and they're not necessarily the only. And instead, we have to be humble to that there are many ways of understanding this world. It also means restoring balance with Native values and goals and building relationships with each other, and then anchoring an indigenous agenda in how we do things. So when you're like, how do I start? Well, you have to accept it's a constant form of study, it's a conversation, and it's a practice. What they also say in Decolonization Is Not a Metaphor is it is sometimes irreconcilable. It is sometimes it's not going to be perfect, and it sometimes is not going to be like all happy and great and joyful. Sometimes it's going to be hard. Sometimes it's going to be grief. Sometimes it's going to be anger. Sometimes it's not going to make sense, and sometimes it's going to implicate you. And so how do you sort of take on that responsibility if you want to participate in this? Now, what I think is important to understand, finally, because I'm gonna end here. There's like so many ways that this happens in our everyday lives, but I wanted to give you one clear example. So Jean O'Brien talks about firsting and lasting, and this happens a lot in literature. She's like, all over the continent, you have local histories and monuments and signage that narrate the story of the first settlement, the founders. And they talk about like the first school, the first dwelling, the first everything. You see the plaques, you go visit, you're like, look at the first post office, right? She said, as if there's never been occupants who thrived in that place before. To make it first, you are saying, this is brand new. Then what you do with Native people is you make them last. They become the last of their tribe, the last Indians, the last people. This actually erases them and then makes it seem as if they only live in the past. So you first Western culture, and then you last Indian culture. We see this everywhere. Indian people are talked about as the vanishing race, the last of the Mohicans, the last of their tribes, right? You see this like the things that you read, it's always like, oh, there's not very many Native people left, and we mourn them and all these sorts of things. This, she says, does real damage to people because then they have no imagination for how they can see the ways in which there are still living Indigenous peoples, and also that our methodologies, our science, our knowledge is really modern to this era and will be what moves us forward. So Mark Rifkin, this is like another place. Mark Rifkin offers, there's a book, you can read it. It's called Settler Common Sense. And what he says is, think about how the texts that you register and recirculate actually create and recirculate everyday modes of settlement. And how we might read texts in this way about how settlers' sovereignty is actually perception and possibility, and what happens to our view of American history when Native narratives are not just included, but privileged, and why are settler colonial viewpoints considered must-read or canonical, but not Native viewpoints. And he points out some very particular examples where what you notice is that most canonical American writers take part in the legacy of displacing Native Americans. This gets taken for granted. It's sort of like how they don't even really get mentioned. It talks about us as dispossessed. It treats it as settled. And it says for new generations, this is common sense. This is how we operate. I always use the Grapes of Wrath as an example, where in the Grapes of Wrath, they're like, and then we had this land in Oklahoma, and then these people came and took it, and we were really sad because we were the farmers there, and we had to come out to California. And my response to that was, that must be hard, right? When someone shows up out of nowhere and takes your land that you've lived on for generations, and then you are displaced and have to remove, but you have no context for that. That's exactly what you did to Native people. So it treats this story as invisible. He uses the example of Thoreau, and then he also uses the example of Melville. And he says it keeps our imagination from being able to imagine beyond property ownership and perpetual debt. It makes wilderness a natural form and function. It acts as if there was no Indian people on these lands. It takes away the possibility of like progressive movements forward. It actually talks about displacement as natural. So I want us to think about this as we end tonight, because I think what happens is we start to think about these stories and the things that we teach. And again, we are told that they are somehow normal, neutral, and naturalized. But this is, I'm gonna end here. This is my daughter's 4th grade mission project, which when they told her that she had to do the 4th grade mission project, I actually told her that we would do it, we would build the San Diego mission, and then we would set it on fire and turn that in because that would be historically accurate. Because when they first built the mission, the Kumeyaay showed up, set it on fire, and burned it down. Her teacher was like, you can't set it on fire because we have to turn something in. So instead she built a mission, and then she put flames all over it. And then she wrote her essay about the Kumeyaay revolt against the San Diego mission in 1769. The questions that she was asked to answer were, how did the Spanish influence the structure of the mission? And why is the mission important to California history? And she entirely on her own wrote this essay in which, instead of foregrounding the Spanish in this essay, she talked only about the Kumeyaay. And she says things like, this mission is important to California because it was the first mission built. 6 years after they built the mission, the Native Americans were tired of being treated badly by the priests, and they set the mission on fire and led the revolt. This is important to California's history because it shows that Native Americans were fighting against the mission system from the very beginning. And then I love the way she ends. So she says, like, a lot of Kumeyaay were mad and scared and decided to revolt against the mission system. On November 4th, 1775, the Kumeyaay set the mission on fire and tore apart the chapel. The whole mission was burned to the ground, but after that, the Spanish rebuilt it. And then in a parenthesis, she wrote, sadly, which I thought was really funny. So I asked her, like, after this was done, after this was over, and if you want to see it and read more about it, it's actually up on my blog. You can see like the report, you can see what she wrote, you can see what I wrote about it. If you were like, I want to see this, I want to do something like this. But I will say, after I was done, I asked her, because, a lot of people will say to me, like, you can't teach a fourth grader about what really happened in the missions. Because what really happened in the missions was like rape, right? And like people getting like killed, and people killing other people in front of people, right? And they're like, you can't teach a fourth grader about that. And I say to people, do you know who grows up knowing about what happened in the missions? Indian kids. So they already grow up with this story. Who are you protecting when you say we can't tell kids about this? And why do you feel the need to protect them? Also, I asked her point blank when this was done. I said, all the things you've learned, because I told her she could actually take a little padre and hang him from the bell tower, because they did that too. And she was like, no, thank you. But I was like, of all the things you learned, does this make you sad? Does this make you feel like something's wrong? Are you like sad about Indian people? Are you sad about what you learned? She said, no, this makes me think that Indian people are strong, that they are powerful, that they did something really important, that they were fighters. It makes me think about that. And it really made me realize, like, she wouldn't have gotten that story otherwise. And suddenly she was learning about Indian people as resistors, and that we were still here, and why that was so important. And then I thought, what about all the kids who don't get to learn that? And instead what they learn is this other story. And then how do they walk out of that knowing like these sorts of things? So in the third grade, she had to go to the Gold Rush Village, because we were living in San Diego, and they took her to the Gold Rush Village. And I remember her coming home and being like, they didn't really talk about what happened in the gold rush. They didn't really talk about what they did to us. And I was like, you're right. And then she's like, and they want me to dress up like a miner tomorrow and go back to school so we could talk about like the mining thing. And I said, you're not dressing up like a miner unless you want to put red blood all over your hands, and then we can go in like that and we could talk about it. And she was like, no. She goes, but I do want to say, like, I want to tell them about our people. I want to tell them about what we did. So to think about the ways in which like you think about the role of the narrative that you're telling, they internalize it in every single grade. And then they're given the same story over and over again. But when they're told stories, histories, novels, imaginatory spaces, that's where they become liberated to build the next world. That's how we're going to solve the problems. So I encourage you all to think about that as we head off and hopefully imagine some big things together. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Wow, that you and Dr. Morehead gave us so much to think about, and we really appreciate your wisdom. You had said questions and answers. I know it's 7 o'clock and some people might need to sign off, but if you had some questions, maybe you would be around for a few minutes.
Yeah, I can stick around for a few minutes.
And I put the evaluation, if people can, I can also email it to people, but we would love your input. I am going to stop the recording, but if you have questions, just go ahead and unmute.